Welcome to Future Knowledge, a podcast about knowledge, creativity, and policy, brought to you by the Internet Archive and Authors Alliance. Think of your everyday interactions with technology: scrolling, swiping, clicking. They feel intuitive, even effortless. Behind that seamless experience is a history shaped by women whose contributions have often gone unrecognized. As the field of interaction design took shape over the past 50 years, many of its most influential architects entered quietly through side doors, not always invited, but impossible to ignore once they were inside. Hi, everyone. I'm Chris Freeland, and I'm a librarian at the Internet Archive, and I want to welcome you to today's book talk. Today, we're exploring In Through the Side Door by Erin Malone, a groundbreaking account of the women who helped invent and define the field of interaction design. Our conversation today will be led by author and interaction designer Abby Covert. So, with that, here to introduce our speakers and set the stage for today's discussion is Dave Hansen, the executive director of Authors Alliance.
Thanks, Chris. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the talk today. I'm Dave Hansen, Executive Director of Authors Alliance. Part of this talk series, one of the things that I really enjoy about this is when we're able to surface discussions and books that really get at stories that maybe a lot of people have missed about how we learn from and interact with each other. And this is one of those books that I think is really special. So I'm really, really pleased to introduce our author and collaborator today on this talk. But first, I'm delighted to introduce Abby Covert. She is an author, teacher, and community leader in the field of information architecture, and her work aims to make information architecture and sense-making skills available to everyone. She has a pretty awesome website, so you should check that out. She is the chief sense maker at the Sense Makers Club, where she curates daily peer-led discussions about topics like information, governance, change, leadership, knowledge management, and ethics. And her two books that I point you to are, the first is called How to Make Sense of Any Mess, which I had encountered before this talk, and it's really awesome. And she has another book also called Stuck, Diagrams Help. I won't dwell on those too much, but I would encourage you to go check them out. They're really neat resources. And Abby will be in conversation today with Erin Malone, who is the author of In Through the Side Door. Erin is professor and chair of the Interaction Design BFA program at California College of the Arts. She teaches a number of classes there: visual interaction design, IXD foundations, behavior and interaction design history. And she's been the principal interaction designer at Experience Matters Design. One thing I learned about her that's pretty interesting: she spent several years consulting with the Anti-Defamation League Center for Technology and Society, working on fighting hate in online social spaces and games. It's pretty impactful work. And she has a long history here. She spent 4 years at Yahoo building and managing the platform user experience design team. She's worked at AOL, at Alta Vista, and a number of other Silicon Valley firms. She started her work in Silicon Valley at Adobe. I'm really pleased that she's a writer because this is a pretty amazing book, and I'm so glad to introduce her and have her lead us through this story of women in interaction design. So thank you, and I will turn it over to Abby and Erin.
Thank you so much. So just to give a little bit of background about how this book came about and a little bit about my research process before we get into the conversation, I was working on a different book during the pandemic, and I got to a point where I couldn't go any further because of the pandemic. I needed to be able to get into archives. So at the same time, I was also teaching a history of interaction design at California College of the Arts for the first time. And I was amazed that there weren't any stories of women other than Brenda Laurel and Susan Kerr. And so I started to look through all the design books I have on women in design, and I kept finding bios of Brenda Laurel and Susan Kerr. And I was like, I've worked with so many women over the years. There's got to be more here. So I switched from the book that I was writing to start writing this book. And in the process, I also realized there was not a history of interaction design at all. There's a lot of pieces in a lot of places. So I wanted to dig out those hidden stories about women in, who design technology. So I started by looking through all my women in design books and finding who was covered, who was not, what was the structure of the books, how were those put together. A lot of these women in design books are just profiles, one after the other, without anything stringing them together. But I spent a lot of time perusing those, mostly graphic design, architecture, interior design, and some games. And then I reached out to my network across social media, across Twitter before it was X, LinkedIn, etc., through my user experience design and interaction design community. And I asked people, if you were to read a book about women in interaction design, who should be in that list? And this is just one example of the many, many spreadsheets I have of names. And you can see there's more people than just Brenda Laurel and Susan Kerr involved in this industry. And you see an explosion of women coming into the field of computers and software design after the graphical user interface came into being. And so you have people that are doing user research and graphic design and visual design and writing and all kinds of cognitive psychology and social psychology coming into this field, not as computer programmers. So I also spent a lot of time in the Wayback Machine looking up websites, trying to find stories of women, particularly in the early era of the web. So there's a sort of an era pre-web where you've got in the mid 80s with Apple and all the software design, and then as the web comes online, as well as CD-ROM. So I trolled through hundreds and hundreds of websites on the Wayback Machine. I also did deep dives into technology and design history, looking at computer history and how things came about and who was involved, much more technical than where I get into in the book. But I wanted to make sure I was having a good wide range. And there's a lot of people that I wrote about that actually ended up not being in the book. And I'll talk about that in a little bit. I also, in the process of writing, once I had my contract with MIT Press and submitted a manuscript, then, peer review, came back, did some rewriting, and I basically rewrote the whole book in terms of all the connection content that strings together the small profiles. And so I dug into feminism and critical race theory. And in the final book, I ended up mapping the eras of interaction design to the waves of feminism up until 2012, which is where I stopped. But I also did a lot of work in looking at gender and technology and new media. Many of these books that I'm showing right here, I actually found first on the Internet Archive and decided I actually needed my own copies that I could highlight and put post-it notes in. And then I went back, way back, old school to index cards where I put all my quotes and things and collecting. So this was a 2.5 year process that from the start of this sort of mission to get these stories. And in that process, I started doing some social media announcements of the accolades and the contributions of many of the women who I was researching. And so I pushed these out across social media for over 2 years. And then I also, in the process, I interviewed about 55 or more women in the field. There are several women who are no longer with us, but talking to people about, their experiences and how they got involved in technology. And then I took all those little snippets. I self-published a little book that's a timeline that's also on my website. The timeline is on the website. Just to When I was testing self-publishing, I did this kind of before I had a contract with MIT Press. And this became a nice little giveaway, and also was selling these to help fund being able to pay for an editor, because publishers don't give you all that information, all those resources anymore. And then there is a website where all the people that I ended up cutting from the book, even though I may have quotes from them, are on this website, Women in Interaction Design. And I've been publishing these over the last 2.5 years as about a couple a month, maybe once a month. It ebbs and flows depending on my schedule at school. And then the output is the end of it is the book. So that's just a little bit about my process for how I got here and all the kinds of things that I ended up doing with the research that are above and beyond the book.
Erin, hi. I'm
Hey,
so
Abby.
excited to talk to you about this. So, first of all, I just want to say congratulations. Like, this is a tremendous body of work, not just the book that I'm holding, which is amazing just to get a book that someone can hold, but also the body of work behind it and just how deep you went into the research. So I know that you just gave us like kind of like the really broad strokes of your research process. Is it okay if I get a little nerdy with you? And
Yes, please.
okay, cool. So the first thing I want to talk about is your why. Like you mentioned that it was 2020 and you couldn't go any further on your other project, but I have a hard time believing that that's like enough to get us through here. So what is the big why? Like, is it about future generations? Like, I put this much 2.5 years of your life into documenting this history.
I was pissed off. So that was the end. I had this, I was taking over this interaction design history class from a previous professor who went on sabbatical, and he's amazing. And he actually helped me with my proposal to MIT Press. But in his list of resources that he referred to, there were no women other than Brenda Laurel. And in his book, as I went through it, which is more a history of industrial design in Silicon Valley, and there's a very little bit about interaction design. There's not very many women mentioned, and that really pissed me off because we hear the stories of the men, and you get this mythology of the brilliant and white guy, and they are all white for the most part, and that just didn't map to my personal experience of working with amazing people across the spectrum. And so I started to dig in because I wanted to tell these stories in my class. And then I just started writing. And I was like, I'm going to do this because this doesn't exist.
Yeah. Oh, we share that as a motivation writing for our students. So another thing that we share is information architecture as a massive background and also interest. So I want to talk to you about the information architecture approach of this book. You showed us one spreadsheet, and I know to be only one of many, many spreadsheets. Can you tell us, like, how did you think about the structure of the book and exactly how many iterations did you go through in terms of structure?
I went through about 16 different iterations of the structure. When I started the book, I thought, I'm going to do, like many of the graphic design books, 100 women in interaction design. And when I say interaction design, I'm including sort of the broader scope of user experience design. So that includes the UX writers and the UX researchers and the information architects. Those of us who are working on the design and design side of things as opposed to the programming side of things. And I started out, that's where a lot of the lists and the spreadsheets came from. And I thought, how am I going to organize this? Is it going to be by date? I mean, date's obvious. And that ended up being sort of a super structure framework for the book. But then I was looking at, do I do the visual designers, the hardcore interaction designers, the cognitive psychologists, the UX researchers, and many of the spreadsheets are organizing people into those buckets. But if you worked a long time, like I have, you have worn all those hats. And so what is the primary? And that got to be really messy. So I ended up breaking it down into sort of the timeline buckets mapped to the waves of feminism. So you have that first wave, well, actually the second wave, because the first wave were the suffragettes, but the second wave with women's liberation and people being able to get jobs, to have their own credit cards, have their own checks and bank accounts without their husbands or their fathers. And that coincided about the time that we start to see women working at like Xerox Park and Bell Labs and some of these other places. And mostly they were mechanical engineers, electrical engineers, and cognitive psychologists. But they were doing interaction design and research. We didn't have that vocabulary yet. And so that's sort of the overarching. And then I took each of those sections and divvied them up into sort of the practitioners, the educators, and the community builders, because we find that many of the women involved, while they may not have leadership roles in the companies they worked at, particularly in the early days, they were instrumental in creating the organizations that support people in our field. So, SIGCHI, which is a special interest group in the ACM. You've got UXPA, which used to be UPA, which is the Usability Professionals Association, the Interaction Design Association, which unfortunately just folded, the Information Architecture Institute, which also folded during the pandemic or right before. Most of those organizations, if not spearheaded, were led by women for quite a long time. And those organizations gave women the support, the professional support, and the opportunity to be leaders in their field. And so those sort of little buckets inside practitioners, educators, community builders is how I ended up organizing. And then there's the one section later where there's leaders, because we start to see in the mid 2000s women moving into leadership and CXO type positions.
Yeah. So let's talk about you in the book, because I was really excited to find that your history is there as well. And I mean, you belong there, Erin. It's amazing. Like Dave gave your bio at the beginning of this, but I want to call attention to just a couple of the things that you will read about Erin doing in this book. Creating the first website for Kodak.
Oh, yeah. I went to grad school at Rochester Institute of Technology, and pretty much the thing is, if you're in design, when you're done with school, you go work at Kodak, or in actually in computer programming too. Everybody works at Kodak at some point. And I started working there freelance before I graduated. And while I was there, and I worked there for about a year and a half after I got out of school. And in that first year, that's when Mosaic came out. And I had taken a bunch of classes in the computer science department, learning HyperTalk and Lingo and all that kind of stuff. And then I had a friend who was a year behind me, and she was continuing to take those classes while I was working. And she's like, "Oh my God, this thing called HTML. You have to learn it. It's so easy compared to HyperTalk and Lingo." And so I played around with it, and there was another guy in the group at Kodak, and he was like, "Hey, we should make a website. Let's ask." And we asked our boss, "Hey, can we make a website for Kodak?" And they're like, "We don't know what that is, but sure." And so it was just a big image map
Yeah.
with 4 sections, and and that's how I got my job at Adobe, because I had worked on a website for Kodak and for myself, and that got me my job working on the website at Kodak for getting that launched, and that was the first website there too.
Sure. And I mean, that's not just the only, it was the first Adobe website. You brought, let's see, the first book about the social web, helped Alta Vista be built just in general, brought community products to AOL, another no big deal, and founded the Yahoo pattern library. So, I mean, you're just in this history with us. So history is really subjective. And I want to talk about how it's sometimes written by people who weren't there, but sometimes it's written by people that were there. So how did you approach the fact that this had contemporary history with folks that you know, like, versus the folks that you didn't know? Like, did you approach those 2 things differently?
So I think I so to set some context, I actually struggled with that a little bit, being an insider. Because I was working on that other book earlier, which is a biography. I did a lot of reading about biographies and how you write biographies and how you approach that in terms of, are you an insider or outside, someone with an objective point of view. And so I did a lot of reading around writing. And then I decided I'm perfectly qualified to write this book, and that it's okay to be an insider because I can ask questions that are grounded in knowing these people. And I did start my list with people I know, from Yahoo, from AOL and stuff. And then I also went back, who was at Xerox PARC, and so I have all these lists of who was at Xerox, who was at Apple, who was at these places, and ended up talking to quite a lot of people that I didn't know. Some I reached out cold call, and some who were introduced to me by other people that I do know.
Yeah.
And I just decided, you know what, I'm qualified to write this. And it's going to be an inside perspective. And I tried to not make it so insider that it was not approachable. But, there is vocabulary and there is terminology that is insider. And you can't help but have that. Otherwise, it doesn't make any sense. So,
Yeah. No, I wanna talk about vocabulary because, I mean, so the book takes readers all the way back as far as the 1950s, and we sort of meet these unsung female heroes of early design, early computing, but the term interaction design doesn't actually enter the scene or fashion until, like, the '80s.
yeah.
So why is interaction design the lens that you chose for the book?
Partly because I am an interaction designer. And even when I was an information architect with a title, I was doing interaction design. And I think I've had all those titles: interaction design, product designer, UX designer, information architect, just designer, graphic designer. And I decided that interaction design as the lens was important because it really is about the software design. And one of the things when I rewrote the book after the peer review, after my second peer review, I realized that I needed to do a little bit of a history of interaction design. And like, where did that come from? So when, as I said, many of the first women in the field were, cognitive psychologists, social psychologists, or had backgrounds in mechanical engineering or electrical engineering. The first wave of women, almost to a person, had PhDs. And many of these people were not allowed to touch these computers unless they had a PhD. But once we get to the personal computer, and I'm particularly talking about Apple versus Xerox part. I mean, Xerox laid the groundwork for the graphical user interface, and we couldn't have done this without Alan Kay, without Adele Goldberg, and all those scientists and those research scientists doing all that work. But Apple brought the computer into our homes, and it became a personal device that now you have emotion and you have personal attachments to things, and you need that branding and that marketing and that user experience and that design. You need that design sensibility in order to make this a desirable object for people to put in their homes. And that was the difference, because it's no longer in people's offices. Now it's in their homes. And so you need the people who understand about emotion and about humans involved in that process. And so that original designers like at Apple and the Human Interface Group, they were called interface designers. They were non-interaction designers, and that's because we didn't have that term yet. And it was Bill Verplank and Bill Mogridge who came up with that term. But you have, a lot of writings, particularly in the collections that Terry Winograd put together with writings from Gillian Crampton Smith and Mitch Kapoor, who talk about this need of design in software as a separate discipline from computer programming. That it's really that. I mean, it was the marketing and advertising need that brought in a lot of the design sensibilities. Is that, as we see, design is often the differentiator that makes the product special compared to its competitors.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So let's talk about the hard part of writing this book. You mentioned that there was 100 women to start. There are not 100 women in this book. How did you pick? Like, that sounds like the hardest information architecture card sorting assignment of all time.
Some of it was luck. Some of it was, as I said, I did all this research into like who worked at Xerox, who worked at Apple. There are plenty of women who should be in the book who are not in the book. Some it was just who responded to my inquiries to do interviews. And if they didn't respond and I couldn't, you know, here's the problem of writing a book about people who've never been written about. There's nothing about them out there. They're not on websites, they're not in books. So how do you write about them if you can't find anything about them and they won't answer, your emails go into spam because I'm like this person that nobody knows. So in some cases it was trying just to get enough of a breadth of an overview of an era and the kinds of things people do, because many of the people, they're exemplars. They're not the only person doing that kind of role in that space at that time. And in other cases, there were people that I thought needed to be in the book. I mean, Susan Kerr is in the book. I didn't talk to her. There's so much written about her. It's not a very long profile. There are other people who I wrote really long profiles about, like Karin Hansen, who I cut. I kept some quotes. And so there are many people I cut. And that was a word count issue. That wasn't a desire of cutting people. That was suddenly I had to be 120,000 words with citations, and they were full citations. And as I rewrote the book, particularly to give a little bit of a history of interaction design, to give some more context of the field within culture, I had to cut people. I had to cut the length of the profiles. I had to cut whole profiles, keeping sort of the most salient quotes in to give. So there's a lot of people mentioned, but you don't find their whole. And all the profiles are pretty short too, because I had to go through and do a cut of like, okay, 1,200 words, 1,200, and just slice them and
Yeah.
see like, okay, what can we get rid of? Which is why I have these amazing interviews with people, and for some people, I ended up talking to them like 2 or 3 hours. I have all this repository of stuff that I'm like, what do I do with that now?"
I mean, something, please put it in time capsule for someone.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's amazing. So let's talk about diversity and inclusion. You mentioned in your lead up talk to this that you had read a lot about critical race theory. How did you think about the folks that you had a harder time finding and who to include from that perspective?
So I was really concerned with trying to make sure that it was representative as much as I could. And it was very frustrating because before the web, the numbers of women of color were very, very small and very hard to find when it comes to sort of the very earliest women and the women kind of in the early section. As I said, most of those women had PhDs. And if you look, I spent a lot of time in the Department of Education stats looking at the breakdown of who graduated with what kinds of degrees and what was the breakdown of demographics. And before the mid 80s, there's very, very few women of color who had PhDs. There's men, but and all the women I interviewed, I asked them about that, and they could not remember any women of color, but they could remember a few men. And the statistics bear that out in terms of from the Department of Education. And then there's a really good book on Black software, and the author talks about the fact that in the 60s and 70s and early 80s and into the 80s, people of color were shut out of computing. And so they just weren't in the pipeline to be working. Now, once you hit the web, you have that democratization of the ability of people to work in this space, and it starts to change. And now, I have there were a lot of women of color that I had on my list and talked to post 2010, but I cut off at 2012. So you see many more, but it's still uneven. I mean, it's uneven of women in leadership and it's uneven across the demographics. So it was tough and I really tried hard. And, that was something that was called out in the first peer review. And I'm like, I'm trying. I can't write about people I can't find.
Yeah.
And that's not to say that they may have been there, but if I couldn't find them. Sylvia Harris, who is really well known in graphic design, not as well known in interaction design. She got her start working in interaction design, working on Prodigy, on video techs, and designing ATMs for Citibank. And then she left the space of interaction design, really taking all she learned about user experience design and research and moved into policy design and designing government. So she worked on the 2000 census and used those design research methodology to test the census forms with over 50,000 people. It was the first time that had ever been done. And it's unfortunate she died in 2011. Then Loretta Staples is another woman who worked at Apple and for Richard Saul Wurman, and she left the space as well. She's a social worker now. So technology and computing and tech companies aren't kind to people who are not the status quo of, the bros. No,
Yeah, no,
not standing
there's
on
a reason that there's a reason that they are leaving for sure.
Yeah.
Mm. Yeah, no, that's a really interesting thing to call out. And also just to think that you went into the Department of Education statistics to figure it out. That's
Oh,
like
yeah. Because
finding researcher that you are. So
I wanted to know. And when I went back and did the rewrite, one of the things I was looking at was books on gender and technology. And there's been several around computing and gender and looking at the reasons why, there's some questions that these researchers ask of like mid 80s, you have a peak of women in computing and then it starts to drop off and they don't know why. And I posit that it's because they've come into design and the women are coming in through design. But that reading those books, I wanted to find out more about it, which is why I ended up spending a lot of time looking at those statistics and tables and things in the Department of Education.
so I want to know about the lessons that you learned in writing this. We've talked a lot about process, but what are you taking away? How would you do the next book differently based on this one?
I think I'd probably start earlier integrating with the culture and what's happening in society. It took me a while to get to the framework of the waves of feminism. I'd probably start earlier. The other thing is I'm a practitioner. The O'Reilly book was a practitioner book all about how to do X, how to do Y. This was my first book that was more academic. And even though I teach, I'm at an art college. I'm not at an R1 academic research university. So I don't write like the academics. So that was tough. I had to learn how to write like more like an academic in terms of bringing in quotes and citations from other scholars to have that conversation. And that took me to the last rewrite. I mean, that's essentially almost 2 years it took me to get there. That's because I had to learn how to write like that. So I'd say for people who are looking to write something like this, if it's a mass market type of thing, write for people. But if it's an academic like a university press, you need to have the citations and the underpinning And you need to call that out in order to, one, give what you're saying credence. And I had to be a little bold in some of my, I believe the reason why women stopped going and majoring in computer science, one, that it's not very welcoming. And two, we found other ways to come into the field through design and writing and research, and in areas that were much more welcoming to women in the field.
Through the side door.
Yeah. And it was somebody else who said that in one of my interviews. They said that I came in through the side door, and I was like, "Oh my gosh, that's really."
I totally feel like that about my career. So I felt like that, yeah, the name of the book really resonated for me as well. I want to talk about what you're working on now because I think it's really nerdy.
It is.
What can you tell us? Like, what can we geek out on about the next project that we can look forward to from Erin Malone?
So I'm working on a biography, and it's a topic I've been working on forever because I'm taking what I did in my master's thesis, which was about Dr. Robert L. Leslie and PM&80 magazine, which was a set of magazines, graphic design, art director magazines that were published between World War I and World War II. And my thesis was on the magazines. I mean, I did full library science, information architecture, cataloging of those for the Cary Library at RIT, and just a little bit on the man. And in the little bit I wrote about him, I parroted what I had read in all the different articles about him. And I thought, this guy's really interesting. He was a doctor. He gave up being a doctor to be a typesetter and, was really bold. He brought all the Bauhaus designers into the field of view of American advertising and design firms. He gave many of them their first ability to be seen in the US and their first jobs. He supported several of them with money and introductions. I mean, he knew everybody in New York. So I wanted to write a full biography of him, and I've had stops and starts over the years, but now I'm getting into it, and it turns out that his story is really a myth in terms of everything before 1927. And, he says he was born in 1885. He wasn't. He was born in 1895. He's a Russian Jew descent, lived in the Lower East Side, and I look at it as if, turn of the century, the mass people, you can make up your own story. Well, he did. He also was investigated by the FBI for many, many years, and Russia called him a spy. The FBI called him a spy. So I'm trying to dig out what's going on with that. His legacy for graphic design is set. He was amazing, and he helped change the face of graphic design in the 20th century. So that part's easy to write about, but this part's about this mystery of who he is he, was he a doctor? I don't know. Was he a spy? I don't know. And the reason why I ended up stopping working on that was because I need to go to New York. I need to spend time in the archives in New York. His archives are there. A bunch of other archives are there. So I started working on this again in January. I'm at a point where I need to go to the archives again, but I've got a fellowship from the New York Public Library to spend time in the archives for the next year. So in the next year. It's kind of an interesting book because I wanted to approach it in the style, kind of writing in an approachable style like Stephen Johnson writes, and I don't know if it's, it may end up now that I'm academic writing, I may be too academic. I don't know. But I've spent hours in the Internet Archive because I found all kinds of things about him in various publications and newspapers that I had no idea of his history before 1927, finding things in various magazines. And he was on the advisory board of a communist and socialist magazine in the 20s. And I also found some elements of some FBI files. So I've spent hours in the Internet Archive digging into all kinds of things.
Do you have a trench coat yet for this episode?
No, I don't.
Like a whole like Carmen Sandiego get up for this whole thing.
I find it super interesting. I'm hoping by the time I'm done writing that other people will as well. And and I'm a little nervous because I'm going to shatter this myth of this man, of his story. I mean, now he's long dead, and most of the people that I interviewed back in the 90s when I was working on my master's thesis are also dead. So I'm not going to hurt anybody's feelings, I don't think, but he still has some family. So we'll see.
If anyone can do it sensitively, it's you, Erin. I believe in you.
Awesome. Thank you. This has been so interesting to listen to, and I can't wait to read what you're writing. That sounds awesome. So Erin, thank you so much, and Abby, thank you as well. And I'm gonna hand it over to Chris.
Erin, Abby, thank you so much for your conversation today. Really appreciated it and enjoyed it. It's a fantastic book. It's an important conversation, and it's something that I think you'll all want to have on your bookshelf and keep with you. Thanks all. Have a great day. Thanks for joining us on this journey into the future of knowledge. Be sure to follow the show. New episodes drop every other Wednesday with bold ideas, fresh insights, and the voices shaping tomorrow.